When people enjoy things like books, movies, TV shows, or video games, they tend to recommend them to others. More often than not, those people are viewing those things through rose-tinted glasses. People always hype things up and make them appear greater than they really are. We've all heard of the hype train. Many of us have even boarded it, and upon arrival to our destination are more often than not entirely disappointed. Or we just don't get the same enjoyment that others do. Once in a lifetime, something will come along that actually lives up to that hype, something that lives up to all of the compliments everyone gives it. These things are more often than not so rare that they can almost become lost to time. If you're like me, your first memories playing RPGs were on the Sony PlayStation 1. However, just before our time, on a slightly older console released a game that would be unfortunately overlooked by a sad number of people, including myself. A game that would break the rules set by those before it, and at the same time set the bar going forward. A game so pivotal to the genre, yet left unplayed and passed up by so many. Let's take a step back in time and look at a game called Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger is a JRPG that was developed by Square for the Super Nintendo. A man by the name of Kazuhiko Aoki set up a dream team of developers, character designers, and musicians. The team consisted of Hironobu Sakaguchi, creator of the Final Fantasy series, Yoji Horii of the Dragon Quest franchise, Nobuo Uematsu as the game's composer, and Akira Toriyama, the creator of the esteemed Dragon Ball Z franchise. Some of the greatest minds of the time, with some of the most amazing intellectual properties, all came together to develop Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger released in North America near the end of the Super Nintendo's lifespan, and within 30 days of its release, the juggernaut of JRPGs, the Sony PlayStation 1, was on shelves in North America. Within a year, Nintendo would also launch its next-generation system, the Nintendo 64. In the blink of an eye, Chrono Trigger, for a lot of us, would be lost to time until 2001 with the release of Final Fantasy Chronicles on the original Sony PlayStation 1. However, by 2001, a lot of people had already moved on to the Sony PlayStation 2, with their hearts and minds already won by Squaresoft's trilogy of Final Fantasy games on the original PlayStation being fresh on their minds. Several years later, Chrono Trigger would receive a port to the Nintendo DS with a new ending, as well as changes to the final boss, which upset some fans of the original game. Those players that missed the release of Final Fantasy Chronicles due to the looming release of the Sony PlayStation 2 now had a second chance to experience the game, assuming they owned a Nintendo DS. Due to these reasons, there are a multitude of JRPG fans out there that have yet to experience Chrono Trigger. Fans that would even consider themselves as JRPG enthusiasts. Those fans like myself have likely heard about Chrono Trigger for years and years, hearing all the praise coming from slightly older fans of the genre. As a kid, I grew up with Final Fantasy VII being my first RPG, quickly followed by 8 and 9. I continued playing JRPGs for many years to come, never questioning the validity of the ones that released before the PlayStation 1. In 2019, I played Chrono Trigger for the first time after hearing about it for years and shrugging it off. Here are my thoughts, and here's why I think you need to play it if you haven't already. When it comes to writing a story-driven game, there's a fine line between an overly complex, convoluted story and one that is simplistic in design with a focus on characters rather than lore. Chrono Trigger begins with our main protagonist, a boy ironically named Chrono, being awoken by his mother. She reminds him that today is the day of the Millennial Fair. He quickly trots off to go enjoy the festivities before he bumps into a girl named Marley. They end up walking around the fair together and having a blast. Later, Chrono meets up with his friend Luca, who's showing off her and her father's newest invention, a teleportation device. Then suddenly, through some sort of freak accident, the machine opens up a rift in time, pulling Marley through. Our hero Chrono jumps through after her, with Luca following behind shortly thereafter. One adventure leads to another, and the team slowly unravels an ancient story about a being named Lavos who fell to Earth millions of years ago, and will one day awaken and destroy the planet in the process. The three end up traveling through time, visiting several eras in their world's history, trying to put a stop to Lavos, while making friends and enemies along the way. While playing through Chrono Trigger, everything felt very straightforward and simple enough. I beat the game and I enjoyed the ending and all was well. Then, later, I started doing some research and I quickly fell down a rabbit hole of alternate timelines and optional endings, which is something I've never experienced with any other JRPG before. But these complexities and branching timelines aren't forced upon players, they're entirely optional, and aren't necessarily relevant to the game's overarching plot. There is a canon ending, however, but Chrono Trigger gives you the opportunity to explore several what-if scenarios after you've completed the game. Generally, at the end of an RPG, the show's just simply over, but with Chrono Trigger, as soon soon as you think your adventure's over, it'll pull you back in. But don't let this intimidate you. Should you decide to play Chrono Trigger, you can progress through the game naturally as you would any other JRPG, and you'll even more than likely get a great ending that'll leave you completely satisfied and possibly even a little teary-eyed. How you experience this game is entirely your choice. I'll be honest, going into playing Chrono Trigger for the first time, the two biggest things that had me hesitant was my assumption that because it was originally released on the Super Nintendo, I'd be in store for more Final Fantasy 1 through 6 era sprite work. That and how time travel would be playing a part in the game. There isn't anything inherently wrong with the sprite work and graphical quality of an 8 and 16-bit JRPG. I just figured I'd be getting more of the same look and feel that I came to know from the older Final Fantasy games. As it turns out, I can't even begin to tell you how wrong I was. Chrono Trigger is easily the greatest looking 2D RPG probably ever created, even when compared to contemporary games. It's honestly almost embarrassing when you compare the graphics and sprite work of Chrono Trigger to any other JRPG of the era. Not only do sprites look great, but the environments are absolutely out of this world. The amount of love and attention to detail is honestly hard to even wrap my head around. I didn't even think games could look this good on a 16-bit console. There are even great examples of rudimentary 3D assets used in-game thanks to the Super Nintendo's Mode 7. The two most popular RPGs on the Super Nintendo are probably Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI. And I'm not gonna sugarcoat this, but Chrono Trigger makes Final Fantasy VI look like child's play in the looks department. I do have to make a note that for all of Chrono Trigger's beauty, when you go out into the game's world map, the sprites look a little derpy. What in God's name happened? How do you go from this to this? My other big concern was that Chrono Trigger was going to use its themes of time travel to set the stage for plenty of tedious and annoying puzzles. Personally, I'm not really a fan of puzzles in RPGs. While there are some side quests that involve traveling to multiple timelines in order to complete some task, they're just that. They're side quests, they're not really puzzles. Alongside this, I was worried that the game's plot would become unnecessarily complicated due to all this time travel, and cause me to either lose track of what's happening or find myself just having a hard time becoming invested in the game's story. Surprisingly, neither of these scenarios came true. The distance the cast travels is measured by thousands of years rather than days, weeks, or hours. This gives you vastly different environments to explore. One of the most important things that separates great JRPGs from mediocre ones, aside from the quality of the game's story, is how the game handles combat. By the time of Chrono Trigger's release, there were already several established formulas used in the genre. Chrono Trigger uses these tried and true formulas but innovates in several key areas. One of the very first things that stuck out to me was the fact that monsters actually appeared on screen, giving the player the ability to run around them to avoid combat. However, this also means that monsters can actually chase you, block doors, and set up ambushes. This isn't anything new in today's standards, but I was surprised to see that JRPGs all the way back on the SNES were doing that when even today it's still not a common practice. The thing that really blew me away though was the fact that there was no transition to a combat screen. Battles take place exactly on the same screen you were on before you came into contact with an enemy. This completely took me by surprise, and even today is sort of a rarity unless you're playing an action-based RPG like Kingdom Hearts. Chrono Trigger uses traditional turn-based combat, however both of these features give combat a sense of urgency that really spices things up. Another somewhat unique element to the game's combat is the fact that party members can use their turns together to perform duel techniques. Each combination of two characters can yield different duel techniques, which creates plenty of unique combinations. Characters can also learn extremely powerful triple techniques that require certain characters to be in the party and use their turns all at the same time. While this adds a nice touch of complexity and customization to combat, I personally found that upon reaching the later portions of the game, I began inflicting more damage on my enemies by having individual characters attacking rather than performing duel techniques. Aside from these techniques, your characters also have the ability to cast magic. However, spells and how they work remain oddly unchanged from your run-of-the-mill Final Fantasy game, which I found to be kinda odd. For me, a world map is a must-have when it comes to JRPGs. It's what instills that great sense of adventure. One of the very first things that got me hooked on JRPGs as a kid was being able to explore the world map of Final Fantasy VII. It always felt like there was something more to be discovered. Chrono Trigger not only has a world map, but it technically has 5. Granted, they're all the same world, but each time period has vastly different landscapes and areas to explore. Eventually, the cast acquires a time-traveling airship, allowing you to explore any location during any time period. You can fly over to a town and then travel into the future and still be hovering at that very same location near said town, which becomes very convenient later on in the game. So these are the basic fundamentals of what to expect should you decide to play Chrono Trigger. It's important to remember games such as this because of the influence that they made on the industry going forward. Chrono Trigger didn't need an intricate story full of lore to tell the story that it wanted to tell. It didn't need 65 plus hours of content to get its point across. It changed the way that we came to assume a game such as this would look, and it carried on many of the traditions of RPGs that came before it, while innovating in just the right ways to be something entirely new and special for its time. A wise old musician once told me that basic is beautiful. meaning a line of music does not need overly complex chords and harmonies to sound pleasant to the ear. The most intricate melody can be broken down to its most basic phrasing and still be the same melody. Complexity does not always guarantee beauty. It's how you choose to apply your abilities to add complexity and layers to a piece of music. Sometimes I wonder if we were really just talking about a piece of sheet music, or something deeper. This parable applies to Chrono Trigger because Chrono Trigger does not waste your time delving into its protagonist's backstory, and it won't spend time elaborating on its villain's origins, and it won't bother you with unfulfilling side quests. There's no flashbacks or long never-ending lines of dialogue, and most importantly, it doesn't overcomplicate things just for the sake of them being complex. Chrono Trigger doesn't do these things to be lazy. When I was writing the script for this video, I was having trouble coming up with what to say next. Chrono Trigger doesn't do these things to be lazy. Well then why does it do it? And why was I so melancholy for a few days after beating it? And that's when it hit me. The one thing that nobody ever talks about is the way in which Chrono Trigger presents its story. Chrono Trigger's entire story is revealed to you, the player, the same way it's revealed to the cast of characters. Everything you, the player, experiences, the party experiences at the same time. Everything we see for the first time in the game, the party is seeing for the first time as well. And never is there a point in the game where you, the player, know something that Chrono and company doesn't. The story is told as though you've always been there since the beginning, alongside Chrono, Marley, Luca, and everybody else, which is perfect for a game about a group of friends on an adventure to save the world, and which is why saying goodbye at the end was so hard. And that's how I want to end this review.
どうしたもう。
もうダメ。おしっこしたいんだな。
そこら辺で勝手にしてくるもん。
よいしょっと。